The sun was barely a sliver on the horizon, casting long shadows over the island of Guadalcanal. The night air was thick with humidity, and the ever-present sound of distant artillery reverberated through the jungle. Japanese pilots, fresh from a brutal aerial skirmish, landed their planes on an airstrip they had fought fiercely to defend. But as dawn broke over the Pacific, something was different. In the distance, rising out of the dense foliage and dirt, was an American airstrip, perfectly paved, fully operational. The Japanese pilot stared in disbelief. Just hours earlier, there had been nothing but mud and makeshift airstrips. Yet here it was, a fully functional runway seemingly built overnight. How could this be? How had the Americans managed to accomplish this seemingly impossible feat? For the Japanese, accustomed to the meticulous planning and months of preparation required to construct airstrips, the sight of this new runway was not just a tactical surprise, it was a testament to the ingenuity and audacity of their enemies. The Americans, in a single night, had achieved what would have taken them weeks, if not months. And as their planes lined up, ready to take off, the Japanese pilots knew that their world had just changed. The construction of an operational airstrip overnight on Guadalcanal in 1942 wasn't just a display of American ingenuity. It was also a direct response to the Japanese military's aggressive air campaign. The Japanese had originally constructed the airstrip on Guadalcanal to support their push deeper into the Pacific. It was a strategic point for them, offering a base from which they could control supply lines, launch air raids on Allied naval forces, and potentially block further Allied offensives in the Pacific. Henderson Field, once completed by the Japanese, was a crucial piece of infrastructure in their efforts to dominate the region. However, with the Japanese defeat at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Allies began to gain momentum in the Pacific, using their intelligence breakthroughs to strike back. The loss at Midway had crippled the Japanese fleet, and the Americans were now taking the fight to the Japanese in the Solomon Islands. The first big test for the Allies would be Guadalcanal, where they landed in August 1942 and quickly engaged the Japanese in fierce ground combat. Both sides quickly realized that air superiority would be the key to dominating the island, and by extension, the Pacific. The situation for the Japanese was becoming increasingly dire. As the battle for Guadalcanal intensified, the Japanese were forced to keep sending reinforcements and supplies to the island by sea. The Japanese Navy, already stretched thin after the defeat at Midway, found itself struggling to maintain the supply lines needed to support the airstrip. Allied naval forces, bolstered by their newly established base on Guadalcanal, were disrupting Japanese supply convoys, further complicating the situation for the Japanese. Despite this, the Japanese were still committed to regaining control of Guadalcanal and its airstrip. Their pilots, experienced and battle-hardened, continued to challenge the American air forces, launching frequent sorties against American ships and ground positions. The Japanese were highly skilled in tactics, but their ability to resupply and maintain their air capabilities was rapidly diminishing. With each passing day, they were forced to fight harder and at greater cost. While the Americans pressed on with their goal to control the island and its airfield. In contrast, the American strategy was centered not just on seizing ground, but on rapidly fortifying and reinforcing the island's strategic positions. The Americans, who had established a beachhead on Guadalcanal in August, began focusing on building up their airstrip at Henderson Field. This was not just a question of holding the land. They understood that an operational airfield was the key to sustained air dominance in the region. If they could establish a permanent base, they could launch air operations across the Pacific, harrying Japanese positions, providing air cover for Allied naval operations, and blocking Japanese reinforcements. The rapid construction of a fully functional airstrip, completed overnight in September 1942, was a result of meticulous planning and preparation. The engineering feats involved were extraordinary, as American forces had to clear jungle, lay down a foundation, and construct a durable surface, all while under the threat of attack from Japanese air forces and naval units. The American ingenuity lay not just in their ability to complete the airstrip, but in their capacity to adapt to the island's rough terrain and the constant threat of Japanese retaliation. This innovation wasn't without its challenges. The island of Guadalcanal was not the most hospitable environment for such a large-scale engineering project. The humidity, dense jungle, and unpredictable weather created severe logistical issues. Yet despite these hardships, the American forces, bolstered by their extensive training and expertise in rapid construction, managed to complete the airstrip with astonishing speed. Using prefabricated materials, bulldozers, and a collective effort by combat engineers, soldiers, and sailors, the Americans constructed a functional airstrip by the morning of September 12th, ready to accept fighter planes and bombers. The sight of a fully operational runway, constructed overnight, shocked the Japanese. They had underestimated the Americans' ability to adapt and rapidly respond to their own strategic challenges. The Japanese were accustomed to a much slower, more methodical pace of construction, often relying on labor-intensive manual work and the gradual buildup of resources. Their own airstrips, such as the one at Guadalcanal, had taken months to construct and required a continuous flow of materials and manpower. The sudden appearance of a fully operational airstrip in a matter of hours not only demonstrated the Allies' superior logistical capabilities but also revealed a tactical advantage that the Japanese had not anticipated. This event marked a critical turning point in the Battle of Guadalcanal. With the new airstrip completed, American bombers and fighters could now operate directly from the island, further strengthening the Allied position in the region. The ability to establish air superiority over Guadalcanal ensured that the Japanese could not easily resupply or reinforce their forces. The rapid construction of the airstrip and the subsequent deployment of American air forces ultimately tipped the scales in favor of the Allies, forcing the Japanese to rethink their strategy and abandon their efforts to recapture the island. The Japanese pilots, who had once believed they held the advantage in the skies, were now facing a formidable opponent, one that could construct and utilize airfields with a speed and efficiency that they could not match. This realization was a blow to Japanese morale, as it became clear that the Americans were capable of operating in ways that were both innovative and devastating. As the Battle of Guadalcanal continued to unfold, the American success in building an airstrip overnight became a symbol of the resourcefulness and adaptability that would characterize the Allied campaigns in the Pacific. The rapid construction of the airstrip on Guadalcanal was not just a tactical victory, it was a deeply human moment that highlighted the resilience, resourcefulness, and determination of the men who made it happen. For the American engineers, soldiers, and Marines, the task of building a fully operational airfield in less than 24 hours seemed impossible. Yet despite the constant threat of Japanese air raids and naval bombardment, they worked with unwavering determination to complete the task. Many of these men were exhausted, having already fought through weeks of brutal ground combat on the island. The physical toll of the fighting was immense, but the task at hand was critical to the war effort. They knew that the success of this operation would directly impact the outcome of the battle, and by extension, the broader Pacific campaign. What stands out in the story of the airstrip's construction is not just the speed at which it was completed, but the sheer willpower and ingenuity displayed by the men who carried out the project. These were not professional engineers alone. They were soldiers, sailors, and Marines who had been trained to fight, not to build. Yet they had to improvise and adapt, using whatever tools and materials they could find on the island. The sense of camaraderie and collective purpose was palpable. It wasn't just about completing a job. It was about keeping the momentum of the war going, about showing the Japanese that the Allies could not be stopped. For the Japanese, the sight of the completed airstrip was a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Many of the pilots and soldiers who had been fighting for Guadalcanal had spent months constructing their own defenses and airstrips, only to see the Americans accomplish in a single night what would have taken them weeks to achieve. To a pilot who had been trained in the harsh realities of war, the construction of an airstrip in such a short time seemed like an impossible feat. It was not just a testament to American ingenuity, it was a psychological blow to the Japanese, who had underestimated the resourcefulness of their enemies. The Japanese pilots were accustomed to the long, arduous process of building airstrips, often facing difficult conditions and limited supplies. For them, the sight of the American airfield, fully operational in less than 24 hours, was not just a technical achievement, but a stark reminder of how much the war had changed. The Americans were no longer just an invading force. They were an adaptable and relentless enemy, capable of achieving what seemed impossible. The shock of seeing the airstrip built overnight shook the confidence of the Japanese pilots who had, until that moment, believed that they could control the skies over Guadalcanal. Now they knew that their advantage was slipping away. The psychological impact on both sides cannot be overstated. For the Americans, the successful completion of the airstrip was not just a victory in terms of logistics, it was a moment of validation. The men who had worked tirelessly through the night, under the threat of attack and in the sweltering tropical heat, saw their efforts rewarded with a fully functional airstrip that would allow them to continue their assault. The completion of the airstrip gave the Americans not just a tactical advantage, but also a powerful morale boost. It was proof that their ingenuity and resolve could overcome the seemingly insurmountable challenges of island warfare. For the Japanese, however, the event was a reminder that the war was evolving in ways they hadn't anticipated. The rapid construction of the airstrip symbolized the American ability to overcome challenges quickly and effectively. It was no longer enough to rely on strategic planning alone. The Allies were proving that they could outpace the Japanese in terms of innovation, logistics, and sheer will. The mental and emotional toll on the Japanese pilots, already fighting on a brutal front, was compounded by this realization. They were now up against an adversary that could adapt faster, fight harder, and build more efficiently. The shock of the Americans' ability to build an airstrip overnight also symbolized the broader shift in the Pacific War. The Japanese were no longer fighting against an underprepared or disorganized enemy. They were fighting against a force that had mastered the logistics of warfare, one that could mobilize resources and execute plans with speed and efficiency. This moment marked the beginning of a psychological shift, as the Japanese understood that their defensive capabilities in the Pacific were increasingly being outmatched by the relentless offensive efforts of the Allies. The speed with which the Americans were able to construct the airstrip on Guadalcanal was an astonishing feat of engineering and logistics. The Allied military effort was built on not just technological superiority, but also on their ability to manage the complex logistics of war. The construction of a fully functional airfield overnight was made possible by a combination of pre-existing plans, specialized equipment, and a highly coordinated effort by troops from different branches of the military. At the heart of the operation was the use of prefabricated materials and the vast stockpile of supplies that had been pre-positioned for such a contingency. The American military had learned from previous campaigns that airstrips would be vital to their success in the Pacific, and they had prepared accordingly. Bulldozers, graders, and other heavy machinery were brought in from nearby islands, and the materials needed to lay the foundation and runway were already on hand. It was a logistical operation of staggering scale, requiring the coordination of engineers, combat troops, and supply units who had little time to waste. The engineers who were tasked with the construction of the airstrip had to work quickly and efficiently, often under the threat of Japanese air raids or artillery strikes. Despite these challenges, they were able to clear the dense jungle, lay down a gravel surface, and build a fully operational runway within 24 hours. The speed with which the airstrip was constructed was a result of meticulous planning, precise execution, and a determination to succeed despite the odds. For the Japanese, the realization that the Americans could not only seize an island, but also establish an airfield so rapidly, was a wake-up call. The Japanese had relied on extensive labor and time-consuming processes to construct their own airstrips, often with limited resources. The ability of the Americans to build an airstrip quickly and efficiently gave the Allies a clear operational advantage, allowing them to project air power across the Pacific with unprecedented speed. This tactical innovation was a turning point in the Pacific War. The successful construction of an airstrip in a matter of hours allowed the Americans to maintain air superiority, launch bombing raids, and provide support for ground forces in a way that the Japanese could not match. The ability to quickly adapt and respond to battlefield conditions gave the Allies an edge that the Japanese simply could not overcome. The speed and precision of the airstrip construction demonstrated the Allies' capacity for innovation, while simultaneously highlighting the strategic vulnerabilities of the Japanese military. The construction of an airstrip in just one night was not merely the work of engineers and laborers. It was the result of strategic foresight and leadership that valued adaptability, efficiency, and innovation in the face of a rapidly evolving conflict. At the core of the operation was American leadership, particularly General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, whose strategic vision of island hopping placed tremendous emphasis on maintaining control over crucial airfields in the Pacific. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal had already been established by the time the Americans made their landing in August 1942. Not only did the Japanese have a stronghold on the island, but they had begun constructing an airfield that would allow them to control the shipping lanes between the U.S. and Australia. The loss of Guadalcanal would mean not just the loss of an island, but the end of the Japanese offensive in the South Pacific and the collapse of their ability to continue pressuring Allied supply lines. In this context, the rapid construction of the airstrip was a response to the critical need to maintain air superiority. It wasn't simply a military challenge. It was a test of the Americans' ability to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies. The decision to push forward with the construction of the airstrip overnight required leaders who could understand the urgency of the moment and act decisively, while trusting their men to carry out the complex task under fire. General MacArthur, already a master of psychological warfare and unconventional strategies, knew that the morale of the troops would be just as crucial to victory as any bomb or bullet. His ability to inspire confidence and trust in his men was key to the success of the operation. The task of building an airstrip quickly was not just about raw military power. It required coordination, innovation, and the belief that the impossible was possible. At the heart of this leadership was a deep understanding of the broader strategic picture. The Allies could not afford to give the Japanese a foothold in the Solomon Islands. If they had to construct an airstrip overnight to gain that critical advantage, they would do it, no matter the obstacles. MacArthur and his commanders understood that innovation, even in the simplest tasks, could make all the difference in winning or losing a battle. By building the airstrip so quickly, they not only gave themselves the tactical advantage, but also sent a psychological message to the Japanese. The Americans were adaptable, capable, and determined to succeed no matter the odds. The Japanese leadership, by contrast, struggled with a more rigid mindset. For the Japanese high command, war was often a matter of strict discipline and meticulous planning. Their approach to constructing airfields, like their approach to other aspects of the war, was methodical and reliant on a steady flow of resources. The idea of completing such a task in a matter of hours would have seemed not just improbable, but borderline impossible. The Americans in this regard were playing a different game, a game where speed, flexibility, and surprise were their greatest assets. This stark contrast in military philosophy and operational flexibility would eventually prove to be a decisive factor in the broader Pacific conflict. From a leadership perspective, the construction of the airstrip represented more than just a technical achievement. It was an embodiment of the American approach to war in the Pacific. It was an extension of their commitment to outpace the enemy at every turn, to demonstrate that no challenge was too great, and to show the Japanese that they were capable of achieving what seemed impossible. The ability to improvise and innovate became a hallmark of American strategy in the Pacific, distinguishing the Allies from their Japanese counterparts who, despite their own tactical brilliance, could not match the speed and adaptability of their enemies. The Japanese military, and especially their pilots, were trained in a system that emphasized patience, precision, and a methodical approach to warfare. The Japanese, who had dominated early in the Pacific War with strategic brilliance and relentless dedication, had built a military culture around careful planning and maintaining control over territory. But as the war progressed, especially with the intensifying Allied counteroffensive, the Japanese found themselves struggling to keep pace with a rapidly evolving conflict. The sight of a fully functional airstrip on Guadalcanal, built in a single night, was a blow to the Japanese, not just tactically but psychologically. For them, the concept of building such an important and complex structure so quickly seemed unfathomable. Their own airstrips were built with painstaking effort, using a constant flow of materials and months of preparation. The American ability to construct a viable airfield almost overnight revealed a disturbing truth. The Americans were capable of outmaneuvering the Japanese not just in combat, but in the logistics of warfare as well. The speed with which the airstrip was completed shattered the Japanese assumption that the Allies would be bogged down by the same challenges they themselves faced. For the Japanese pilots, many of whom had been trained in an environment where success came from careful, sustained effort, the sudden appearance of an operational American airstrip was a stark reminder of how much the Allied forces had adapted and evolved. The Americans were no longer just fighting to defend their territory. They were actively reshaping the battlefield to suit their needs, often before the Japanese could react. The shock was compounded by the psychological toll the war had already taken on the Japanese pilots. By 1942, many had been fighting on multiple fronts for years, their numbers dwindling as casualties mounted. The sight of an American airstrip springing to life almost overnight was a reminder of the Allies' resilience, and it had a profound effect on Japanese morale. The Japanese pilots, already fatigued from years of war, now faced an enemy who seemed to defy the very laws of warfare, an enemy who could overcome obstacles that would have been insurmountable for the Japanese themselves. For many Japanese soldiers, this event was the first realization that they were fighting an enemy that had more than just numbers or technology on their side. They were up against an enemy who was capable of changing the game entirely. The psychological blow this dealt to the Japanese military leadership and their pilots cannot be overstated. The Americans had turned the tide in Guadalcanal with more than just bombs. They had done it with speed, innovation, and the ability to surprise. The true turning point came on the morning of September 12, 1942, when the American airstrip at Guadalcanal was completed and operational. As the first American bombers began landing on the newly constructed runway, it was clear to both sides that this would be a pivotal moment in the Battle of Guadalcanal. The Japanese, who had been fighting to maintain their hold on the island, now faced a new threat. The Allies had not only seized the island, but had now established an airbase that would allow them to maintain air superiority over the region. This was not just a temporary advantage, it was a strategic game-changer. The Japanese pilots, who had been patrolling the skies above Guadalcanal for weeks, were stunned by the sudden arrival of American bombers and fighters. Until that moment, the Japanese had been able to hold the air, relying on the limited airstrip they had constructed. But now, they were facing a reality where the Americans could use Guadalcanal as a permanent launch point for their own air operations. The speed at which the Americans had completed the airstrip and the fact that it was now being used to launch sorties against Japanese positions sent a shockwave through the Japanese command. The immediate consequences for the Japanese were profound. The strategic value of Guadalcanal had always been tied to its airfield, and now that the Americans had successfully taken it, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted. The Japanese could no longer control the skies above the island, and they struggled to figure out how to adapt. Their supply lines, already under threat from American naval forces, were now further jeopardized by the presence of a well-established Allied airstrip. The Japanese Navy, which had been attempting to resupply and reinforce their troops on Guadalcanal, was increasingly unable to deliver necessary supplies without risking devastating airstrikes from the newly established Allied air force. The construction of the airstrip overnight had been more than just a logistical victory, it was a psychological turning point. The Japanese had long considered themselves superior in their ability to construct and defend airfields. To see an airstrip built from nothing in a matter of hours was not only a tactical shock, but a severe blow to Japanese morale. It highlighted the difference in how the two powers approached warfare. The Japanese relying on careful, meticulous planning, and the Americans who could improvise, adapt, and outmaneuver at incredible speed. This realization was a devastating blow to the Japanese pilots and military command, who now understood that they were up against an enemy capable of executing bold, unexpected moves with incredible efficiency. For the Americans, the completion of the airstrip represented a massive victory, not just militarily but symbolically. It demonstrated their ability to overcome logistical challenges and to operate in a way that the Japanese could not anticipate. It proved that the Allies were not just holding their ground, they were adapting to the unique challenges of the Pacific War, finding ways to strike quickly and decisively. The construction of the airstrip, executed with precision and speed, was a direct challenge to the Japanese belief in their own superiority. forcing them to reconsider their strategy and approach to the war. The airstrip's completion and the arrival of Allied bombers marked the beginning of a decisive phase in the Pacific War. It gave the Americans a crucial foothold in the Solomon Islands, allowed them to maintain pressure on Japanese forces, and paved the way for further victories in the Pacific. The Battle of Guadalcanal, already a brutal conflict, would now be marked by a new dynamic. The Japanese were no longer fighting just for control of the island, but for their ability to maintain air superiority in the Pacific. And with each passing day, the Japanese would find it increasingly difficult to regain control as the Allies' air operations grew in strength and frequency. The turning point was not just in the air, it was in the minds of the men who fought. The American pilots and engineers, inspired by the ingenuity and sheer will of their comrades, now knew that they could achieve what had once seemed impossible. The Japanese pilots, by contrast, were faced with the grim reality that the Americans could outmaneuver them at every turn, both on the ground and in the skies. As the American bombers began to land on the newly constructed airstrip, the strategic and psychological impact on the Japanese military was undeniable. By the time the first waves of American aircraft took off from the newly established airfield on Guadalcanal, the Japanese High Command understood that they had lost their most important advantage in the Pacific. What had been an island under their control, critical for launching attacks and maintaining air superiority, was now an Allied stronghold, from which the Americans could launch bombings and airstrikes against Japanese positions at will. This shift was not just tactical, it was a profound blow to Japanese morale. The speed at which the Americans had constructed the airstrip was a revelation to the Japanese military leadership. They had long believed that they held the upper hand when it came to fortifying positions and securing airfields. Their meticulous planning, grounded in the idea that any position could be held with sufficient preparation, had been shattered by the Allies' rapid, almost effortless ability to re-establish air superiority. The fact that the Americans could build such critical infrastructure so quickly sent a clear message. The Allied forces were capable of overcoming seemingly insurmountable challenges at a pace and scale the Japanese could not match. The Japanese pilots, many of whom had been flying against American bombers and fighters for weeks, were deeply shaken by the sight of American planes operating from Guadalcanal. The battle had been brutal up to this point, with neither side willing to yield. Japanese air superiority, which had been unchallenged for much of the early war, was now being contested by the Americans, who had demonstrated not just superior numbers, but an ability to adapt quickly. For the Japanese pilots, many of whom had been trained to fight a battle of attrition, the speed and innovation of the Americans felt like an insurmountable challenge. But the consequences of the new airstrip went beyond the battlefield. The psychological impact on the Japanese military command was significant. The Japanese had been locked in a mindset of careful, methodical war, where patience and resource management were key. The Allies' ability to surprise and adapt disrupted this mindset, making the Japanese question their own operational processes. The construction of the airstrip, combined with the subsequent deployment of American aircraft, shattered the illusion that Japan's superiority in engineering and fortification would continue to hold them an edge. This psychological blow would reverberate through subsequent engagements in the Pacific. For the Japanese High Command, the construction of the airstrip represented a broader problem. Their ability to react to Allied tactics was failing. The American command, led by figures like General MacArthur, had been able to launch operations with speed, precision, and flexibility, all while maintaining logistical and technological superiority. The Japanese, on the other hand, were struggling to adapt to a war where the enemy could continuously disrupt their positions and reinforce them just as quickly. The rapid construction of the airfield proved that the Allies could not only hold territory but could also reconfigure the strategic map at a pace that left the Japanese leadership scrambling to respond. The effect on the Japanese pilots was compounded by their dwindling resources. The Japanese Air Force, though still formidable, was increasingly stretched thin, unable to sustain the manpower and equipment needed to counter the growing Allied presence. As the Americans continued to operate freely from Guadalcanal, the Japanese could not maintain a sufficient defensive force. Their pilots were fewer, their aircraft older and less effective, and their morale increasingly fragile. The reality of an American airbase on Guadalcanal marked the beginning of a sharp decline in the Japanese ability to control the skies. For the American forces, the completion of the airstrip symbolized not just tactical success, but the power of innovation in warfare. They had taken an island in the Pacific, secured a strategic airfield, and through sheer resourcefulness turned the tide of battle. This victory demonstrated that the American war effort was not just about numbers and firepower, but about adaptability and logistical mastery. It was a clear signal that the United States would not only continue to fight, but would fight smarter, moving rapidly to capitalize on every opportunity presented. The airstrip was not just a physical structure, it became a symbol of the Allied ability to disrupt, surprise, and dominate. The psychological shift that occurred on both sides was profound. The Japanese, who had once been masters of surprise and efficiency, now saw an enemy capable of matching and even surpassing their strategic innovations. The Americans, emboldened by their success, now knew they could accomplish the seemingly impossible. The Allies were no longer just defending or reacting to Japanese moves. They were taking the initiative, disrupting Japanese plans before they could even be realized. This change in momentum marked the true turning point in the Pacific War, where the Japanese found themselves on the defensive, their ability to maintain control of key territories and airfields unraveling with each passing day. As the battle for Guadalcanal continued to unfold, the strategic importance of the airstrip would grow. The American ability to maintain air superiority over the island would prove to be the final nail in the coffin for the Japanese forces. With air support now secured, American ground forces could operate with impunity, while the Japanese struggled to maintain their supply lines and defend against constant bombardment from the skies. The construction of the airstrip, completed in a matter of hours, was a masterstroke that not only tilted the balance of power in Guadalcanal, but also marked the beginning of the end for Japan's dominance in the Pacific. The completion of the airstrip on Guadalcanal in September 1942 marked a decisive shift in the battle for Guadalcanal, one that would have far-reaching consequences for both the Allies and the Japanese. As American bombers and fighter planes began to operate from this new airfield, the Japanese could no longer maintain their tenuous grip on the island. The airstrip provided the Allies with a critical advantage, enabling them to launch devastating airstrikes against Japanese positions, disrupt their supply lines, and reinforce their ground forces with relative ease. The loss of Guadalcanal and its strategic airfield was a turning point for Japan in the Pacific theater. In the weeks following the completion of the airstrip, the Japanese found themselves increasingly unable to respond effectively to Allied air and naval power. The United States had successfully established an unassailable position on the island, and the newly built runway allowed for constant American air patrols that disrupted Japanese operations in the region. The Japanese had invested heavily in their attempt to hold Guadalcanal, but with the American airstrip now fully operational, their efforts were in vain. Despite several attempts to retake the island, including heavy naval battles and a last-ditch effort to reinforce their positions with additional troops and supplies, the Japanese were unable to regain control. The psychological impact on the Japanese forces was significant. The Japanese military had long prided itself on its engineering capabilities and its ability to construct strongholds that could withstand prolonged sieges. The American ability to build a fully functional airstrip in such a short amount of time was a humiliating blow to Japanese morale. They had underestimated the ingenuity of their enemies, and now the reality of facing a relentless and adaptable foe set in. For the Japanese soldiers and pilots who had spent months trying to fortify their positions and build their own airstrips under difficult conditions, the speed and efficiency with which the Americans had established their airbase on Guadalcanal was a sobering reminder of the Allies' resolve and resourcefulness. As the battle for Guadalcanal wore on, the Japanese were forced into a defensive posture. The Allied forces, with their newly established airbase, now had the advantage of air superiority, which allowed them to carry out bombing raids on Japanese-held positions throughout the Solomon Islands. The Americans were able to disrupt Japanese naval movements, harry their supply lines, and provide much-needed air cover for ground operations. Meanwhile, the Japanese, unable to resupply or reinforce their troops effectively, were increasingly unable to sustain their defenses. The loss of air superiority over Guadalcanal proved to be the key factor in their eventual withdrawal from the island. For the Americans, the successful completion of the airstrip and the subsequent establishment of a permanent base on Guadalcanal was a much-needed victory. After a series of difficult campaigns and heavy casualties, the ability to launch sustained air operations from Guadalcanal provided the Allies with a critical foothold in the Pacific. It allowed them to secure the island as a base of operations for future campaigns and laid the foundation for further Allied offensives in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and beyond. The psychological boost for the American forces was immense. Not only had they captured a key piece of territory, but they had demonstrated their ability to innovate and outmaneuver the Japanese, who had once seemed invincible. The strategic importance of the airstrip went far beyond Guadalcanal itself. By securing control of the island and its airfield, the Allies could now project power across the Pacific. The establishment of a reliable and permanent base allowed the Americans to disrupt Japanese supply lines, conduct airstrikes against critical targets, and support Allied naval forces throughout the region. The Allies were now able to strike at Japan's vital supply lines, hitting the heart of Japan's war effort and weakening its ability to fight back. In the broader context of the war, the fall of Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the Japanese retreat across the Pacific. While the Japanese had been successful in the early years of the conflict, their inability to adapt to the rapidly changing nature of the war left them vulnerable. The Americans, through strategic innovation and sheer determination, had found a way to turn the tide. The airstrip built overnight became not just a symbol of Allied ingenuity, but a turning point in the Pacific War, one that would eventually lead to the downfall of the Japanese Empire. In the months following the construction of the airstrip on Guadalcanal, the Japanese found themselves struggling to regain their footing in the Pacific. The defeat at Guadalcanal marked the first major land-based defeat for the Japanese military in World War II, and it had profound consequences on their strategic and psychological outlook. The loss of the island was not just a tactical setback, it was a blow to their confidence and their ability to project power in the Pacific. The loss of Guadalcanal and its strategic airstrip had significant ramifications for Japanese naval and air forces. The Japanese had relied heavily on their control of airfields for both offensive operations and resupply. With Guadalcanal firmly in Allied hands, the Japanese were no longer able to use the island as a launch point for further expansion or to disrupt the Allied supply routes. The Japanese Navy, already stretched thin from years of conflict and now facing mounting casualties, was unable to respond effectively to the increasing American pressure. The psychological toll on the Japanese military was profound. The loss of an island they had invested so heavily in, both in terms of manpower and resources, was demoralizing. The ability of the Americans to quickly construct an operational airstrip was a stark reminder of the flexibility and adaptability of the Allies. For the Japanese High Command, who had relied on slow, deliberate planning and resource-intensive construction efforts, the sight of a fully functional airfield built in a matter of hours was a wake-up call. It was clear that the Americans had the ability to outthink and outmaneuver them on the battlefield, and the Japanese realized that their traditional approach to warfare would no longer suffice. The loss at Guadalcanal had lasting consequences for the Japanese Air Force. Their pilots, once considered among the best in the world, were increasingly sent into combat with older aircraft and fewer reinforcements. As the battle for Guadalcanal raged on, the Japanese Air Forces faced constant attrition, with pilots lost at an alarming rate. The inability to sustain air operations from Guadalcanal further weakened their strategic position in the Pacific. In the long term, the Japanese Air Force would never fully recover from the damage inflicted during the battle. For the Americans, the successful establishment of an airstrip on Guadalcanal was a decisive moment in the Pacific War. It symbolized not just the military victory on the island, but the broader success of the American strategy of island hopping. The ability to secure airfields rapidly allowed the Allies to push further into the Pacific, taking key islands one by one. The American airstrip on Guadalcanal became a launching pad for future operations, including the campaigns in New Guinea, the Philippines, and ultimately, the eventual push towards Japan itself. The success of the airstrip was also a testament to the power of logistics and innovation. The Americans had developed a system that could quickly adapt to the challenges of island warfare, creating infrastructure that could sustain long-term operations. The Allies had learned how to project power in a way the Japanese simply could not match. The logistical capabilities that allowed the Allies to build airstrips and deploy aircraft at lightning speed became a key part of their success in the Pacific. While the Japanese had focused on building fortifications and static defenses, the Americans were able to keep the pressure on, relentlessly advancing and adapting to the changing needs of the war. The psychological impact of the airstrip on the American forces was equally significant. The construction of a fully operational airfield in a matter of hours gave the American soldiers, sailors, and airmen a profound sense of accomplishment. It was a moment of triumph that underscored the resilience and resourcefulness of the American military. For the troops who had been involved in the construction, it was a powerful reminder of what they could achieve when they worked together, despite the odds. The successful completion of the airstrip on Guadalcanal reinforced the belief that the Allies could adapt to any challenge and continue to push forward toward victory. As the Pacific War continued, the Battle of Guadalcanal and the construction of the airstrip became a symbol of the broader shift in the balance of power. The Japanese, who had once seemed invincible, were now on the defensive. The Americans had gained a crucial foothold in the Pacific, and their ability to maintain air superiority would become a critical factor in the eventual defeat of Japan. The success at Guadalcanal was a turning point that signaled the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire in the Pacific. The rapid construction of an airstrip on Guadalcanal, completed in a single night, became more than just a logistical triumph. It symbolized the resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity that would define the Allied victory in the Pacific. In the chaos of war, where time was often the most precious commodity, the ability to build an operational airfield overnight was a powerful testament to the strength of the American military machine. But it was also a striking reminder of how war, in its most fundamental form, is fought not just on the battlefield but in the hearts and minds of those involved. For the American soldiers, sailors, and engineers who worked tirelessly to create the airstrip under the threat of constant attack, the achievement was an embodiment of their determination. In the face of extreme conditions and overwhelming pressure, they displayed an extraordinary level of resourcefulness. What had been a contested, rugged island, once the domain of the Japanese, was transformed into a crucial Allied stronghold, from which the tide of the Pacific War would slowly begin to turn. On the other side, for the Japanese, the sight of the completed airfield was a psychological blow. It shattered their perception of their own superiority. They had built airstrips with painstaking effort, and now they saw an enemy capable of accomplishing what had seemed impossible. The loss of Guadalcanal and the airfield was the beginning of the unraveling of Japan's defensive perimeter in the Pacific, and the psychological impact on the Japanese pilots and commanders would resonate for the rest of the war. The ability of the Americans to adapt so quickly, to seize the initiative with such rapid and decisive action, represented a shift in the war's momentum that the Japanese could not easily counter. In the broader scope of the war, the construction of the airstrip was more than just a symbol of military efficiency. It was a defining moment in the Allied approach to warfare. The Americans' ability to outmaneuver, outlast, and innovate under pressure gave them an edge over the Japanese, who were stuck in a system that valued meticulous, often slower methods. The construction of the airstrip became a turning point, not just on Guadalcanal but for the entire Pacific campaign, laying the groundwork for the island-hopping strategy that would lead to the eventual defeat of Japan. And as the war dragged on, the legacy of that single night of work would echo throughout the Pacific. The Americans had proven that they could not only survive the harshest conditions but thrive in them. The Guadalcanal airstrip was a powerful example of how a well-coordinated, adaptive, and resolute force could achieve victory, even when the odds were long. It wasn't just about raw power. It was about the will to overcome, the ability to adapt, and the understanding that innovation and ingenuity would often be as decisive as any weapon. As we look back on this moment, we see that the battle for Guadalcanal, with its brutal fighting, loss of life, and strategic importance, was also a battle of ideas. The Allies, through their rapid construction of the airstrip and their unrelenting drive, demonstrated that innovation could change the course of a war. They showed the world that a war of attrition could be won not just with superior firepower, but with the ability to adapt, think creatively, and move faster than the enemy. The creation of the airstrip on Guadalcanal, built under the threat of constant attack, was a moment of triumph that stretched far beyond the immediate tactical advantages it provided. It was an emblem of the Allied capacity for resilience and innovation, and it forever altered the course of the Pacific War. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when determination, ingenuity, and the collective will to win came together in the most trying of circumstances.